There is a particular cruelty that only polished rooms can produce, the kind built from silk and crystal and the collective decision of 200 people to look directly through you. Vivienne Ashcroft had survived 3 years of it. She had learned to walk through doorways like she belonged in them, to hold a glass of champagne without drinking, to smile at women who smiled back with teeth designed to cut. But nobody warned her that the worst moment of her life would arrive wearing ivory lace and Kedrick Vane's name on every tongue in the room. Nobody warned her that survival, when it finally came, would arrive wearing black, and that it would not ask her permission before it changed everything. The morning of Kedrick Vane's wedding to Isadora Pemberton Holt, Vivienne Ashcroft did not cry. She had already done that. She'd done it 4 months ago in the upstairs sitting room of her aunt's townhouse on Belgrave Crescent, when the letter arrived on Vane family stationery and her hands understood what it contained before her eyes finished reading. She'd done it in the bath 2 days later, the kind of crying that strips something essential from the body, that leaves you lighter in ways that have nothing to do with relief. She'd done it one final time at the dressmaker's, when the woman asked whether the pale green gown was for a wedding, not knowing, or perhaps knowing perfectly well. And Vivienne had said yes, very quietly, and then spent the carriage ride home staring at her gloves. That was 4 months ago. She was finished crying. What she was not finished with, apparently, was her obligation to attend. The invitation had come through her cousin Marguerite, who moved in the outer circles of the Vane social network with the desperate tenacity of someone who understood exactly what exclusion cost in this city. Marguerite had presented it over tea with that particular expression women wore when they believed they were offering something generous. "It would look strange if you didn't come," Marguerite had said. "People would talk." People would talk either way. That was the only certainty Vivienne had carried into the Holt estate on this particular Saturday in October, when the grounds had been arranged into something that resembled a painting more than a party. White roses in architectural formations, footmen stationed at calculated intervals, a string quartet positioned near the south terrace to ensure the music drifted precisely far enough to feel accidental. Isadora Pemberton Holt's family had money the way rivers had water, so much of it that the concept of limitation had never been required to occur to them. Vivienne had arrived 20 minutes late. Not as a statement. She'd simply stood in front of her mirror for longer than usual, unable to identify what she was looking for in her own face. The ceremony had already concluded by the time the carriage deposited her at the gravel path. She could hear the shift in sound that meant the guests had moved inside, glasses meeting glasses, laughter calibrated to carry, and for 1 full minute she sat in the stopped carriage and did nothing at all. The driver did not comment. He was a patient man. Then she stepped out, adjusted the fall of her green skirt, and walked toward the entrance. The first person to see her was Lady Constance Merriweather, who was standing near the reception hall doors with 2 other women whose names Vivienne had long since stopped bothering to retain. Constance's expression performed a rapid journey from surprise to delight, the particular delight of someone who has just been handed something they can use. "Vivienne." The way she said it carried the full weight of a social weapon being unsheathed. "How terribly brave of you." The 2 nameless women looked at each other with the shared pleasure of observers who have arrived exactly on time. "Constance," Vivienne said, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't be fuel. "We were just wondering whether you'd come, weren't we?" Constance glanced at her companions with the confidence of a woman who had never once had to wonder whether she was supported. "I said to Philippa, I said, surely she won't. But Philippa said, well, Philippa was rather more charitable than I." The ceremony went beautifully, the one who was presumably Philippa offered. In the tone of someone handing a lit match to a person standing in a pool of oil, Kedrick looked so settled. That's the word, I think, settled. Vivienne looked at Philippa for a moment. "I'm sure he did." She moved past them before Constance could find her next angle, and the sound of their voices regrouping behind her back felt almost physical, like a door closing that you'd been standing in front of for a very long time. She walked through the entrance hall and into the reception room, and the first thing she saw was the room's fullness, the density of bodies, the brightness, the way 200 people occupied a space and made it feel both enormous and suffocating simultaneously. The second thing she saw was Kedrick. He was standing near the far window with Isadora's hand in his, receiving congratulations from a group of older men who all appeared to have opinions about something. He was tall and fair and dressed in a way that announced money without advertising it, and he was laughing at something one of the older men said, and the ease of it, the complete and unguarded ease of that laugh, hit Vivienne somewhere below the sternum in a way she had not anticipated and was not prepared to examine in a room full of people. She turned toward the nearest servant and accepted a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking. The hour that followed operated according to its own particular logic. She spoke to 3 people she didn't know well, maintained the appropriate level of engagement, and redirected every conversation that moved toward the obvious subject. She ate nothing. She stood in 2 different configurations of guests and observed 2 different dynamics of power and said the right things at the right intervals, and she was, by every visible measure, absolutely fine. It was when she moved toward the corridor that the real architecture of the afternoon revealed itself. She had been attempting to locate Marguerite, who had vanished with characteristic Marguerite efficiency the moment they'd arrived, and had not reappeared. The corridor led toward a small sitting room that Vivienne had noticed on her way in, a room that would offer approximately 4 minutes of privacy, enough to breathe, enough to reset the particular set of muscles that holding yourself together required. She was nearly to the door when she heard her name, not spoken to her, spoken about her. The voices came from just inside the sitting room, through the partially open door, in the register of women who believe themselves alone, low, but not low enough, carrying the texture of people who have been waiting for exactly this conversation. Can't imagine what she was thinking, coming here. The invitation was Marguerite's doing. You know what she's like. But to actually show up, with that dress, honestly. A pause, the specific quality of which communicated unspoken agreement. Kedrick told Isadora months ago that it was never serious, that she'd misunderstood the nature of the arrangement entirely. Did she misunderstand it, or did he simply Felicia? A warning tone, performed rather than felt. It hardly matters now, does it? What matters is that she's here, looking like she's attending her own, a brief laugh, the kind designed to perform restraint. Well, Isadora noticed her immediately. She mentioned it to me not 20 minutes ago. Poor creature. Is she? I think she rather enjoys the attention even when it's this kind. Some people need to be witnessed in their suffering. It becomes its own performance. Vivienne stood in the corridor. Her hand was on the door frame. She did not push the door open. She did not move away. She stood there for what was probably 4 seconds, and what felt architecturally longer, and she understood with the complete clarity of someone who has heard the truth spoken without any obligation to be kind, that this was the version of herself that would be carried out of this house in everyone's pockets. The spectacle, the cautionary note, the woman who came to watch the man who left her marry someone else, and who had the poor taste to suffer visibly. She turned away from the door. The corridor stretched ahead of her, back toward the main reception room, toward the sound and the light and 200 people who were already wearing the story of her presence here like a shared accessory. Her chest felt very tight. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady, which struck her as a strange kind of betrayal on the part of her own body. She would leave. That was the only reasonable thing. She would locate Marguerite, inform her of a pressing obligation, and exit with the kind of composure that might, over several months, become something people remembered instead of the other version. She knew this was what she should do. She walked back into the reception room, and Kedrick looked up from across it and saw her. The look lasted approximately 1 second. It contained nothing identifiable. Not guilt, not warmth, not the awkward acknowledgement of a shared history that most decent people would have managed. It was the look of a man who has filed something away and no longer requires access to the file. Then someone said something to him, and he looked away, and Vivienne was simply standing in the entrance to the room with a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, and the full understanding that she was, at this particular moment, the least significant person in it. Several heads had turned when Kedrick looked. That was the mechanism. People followed the eyes of important people, and those 200 guests had registered the direction of his gaze, and now they were cataloging her position and her expression with the efficiency of a room that runs on social information. She started for the far exit. She did not move quickly. That was the only concession she would make to the performance of dignity. Pace. Whatever else was happening in her chest, her steps would be measured. She was halfway across the room when Isadora Pemberton Holt detached herself from a group near the center and moved into Vivienne's path. Isadora was beautiful in the way of women who have never been required to compensate for anything. A clean, untroubled beauty built on good bones and better resources. The wedding gown was precisely what it should have been, not ostentatious, which would have been a mistake. Simply perfect, which was its own form of aggression. She held a glass of champagne and wore the expression of a woman conducting a social transaction she had prepared for. Miss Ashcroft. She said it the way you'd place a piece on a game board. I'm so glad you could come. The room, or the portion of it that was listening, which was most of it, went very slightly quieter. Mrs. Vane. Vivienne returned the name with the same register and watched something flicker briefly across Isadora's face. Congratulations. You're too kind. Isadora's smile was expert. I do hope you're enjoying yourself. There it was, the question designed to be unanswerable cleanly, that hung in the air with all its implications attached, that required either performance or honesty, and accepted neither without cost. Vivienne felt the particular quality of the silence around her, the held attention of people who had situated themselves in the precise positions that allowed them to observe without appearing to. The estate is beautiful, Vivienne said. It is, Isadora agreed. Then, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this or something close to it, you know, I think it's genuinely admirable, your being here. Not everyone would have the fortitude. The word landed with surgical accuracy. Fortitude, as though grief were a character flaw requiring courage to manage publicly, as though the most charitable interpretation of Vivienne's presence here was a form of endurance. Vivienne opened her mouth. She had no idea what was going to come out of it. Some part of her was already composing the graceful exit line, the thing that would close this without giving anyone additional material. Another part of her, the part that had been standing in corridors and swallowing things for 4 months, for 3 years, for longer than that if she was willing to look at it honestly, was considering doing something that would be talked about for entirely different reasons. She never found out which part would have won, because the room shifted. It was not a loud shift. It was the kind of shift that happens when a significant pressure change occurs. The subtle, full-body awareness of people adjusting their orientation toward something, a current of attention moving in a single direction. And then she heard it, the absence of sound from a specific cluster of guests near the main entrance, spreading outward like a stone dropped in still water, and she understood from the pattern of it, before she turned, before she saw anything, that whoever had just entered this room was someone the room had an involuntary response to. When she did turn, he was already looking at her. Lucian Blackthorne, 5th Duke of Blackthorne, stood at the entrance to the reception room as though the room had arranged itself for his arrival, which it had, or rather, had rearranged itself. The 200 guests having performed that unconscious collective reorganization that occurred in the presence of a person whose social weight was simply that significant. He was taller than she'd remembered, or perhaps the stillness around him created that impression. He wore black with the ease of someone who had decided long ago that convention was a thing other people required. His face was the face she had seen at 4 or 5 events over the years, always across rooms, always accompanied by that particular quality of space that gathered around him, the invisible perimeter that people did not cross uninvited. She had spoken to him twice. Once at a political dinner 2 years ago, a brief exchange about the quality of a particular speaker's argument. Once at a gallery opening, where he had made one dry observation about a painting and moved on. He had not been unkind. He had been, more unsettlingly, interested. The kind of interest that felt like it was measuring something, though she had never been able to identify what. He was looking at her now with that same quality of attention. And then, he was moving. Across the room, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had decided on a direction and found the concept of obstacles academic. The crowd did not exactly part, but it reorganized the way rooms reorganized around people whose intentions communicated themselves clearly without being stated. Isadora Pemberton Holt, Mrs. Vane, registered the trajectory and her expression shifted through several very rapid configurations, landing on something that was attempting to be composed. He stopped beside Vivienne, not across from her, not at the socially acceptable distance that conversation required. Beside her. Close enough that the position itself made a statement in the language of formal rooms that could not be easily misread. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to," he said. His voice was low, aimed at her, but calibrated to carry precisely far enough to be heard by the people who needed to hear it. He did not look at Isadora. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Vivienne with the focused certainty of a man completing a sentence he had started some time ago. Vivienne's mind went very quiet. "You were late," she said. The words came from somewhere sensible in her, the part that understood that whatever this was, the worst thing she could do was hesitate visibly. "I was unavoidably delayed." A pause, in which his eyes held hers with the steady patience of someone accustomed to being waited for. Then, so quietly that only she and possibly Isadora could have caught it, "Pretend you're with me." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Vivienne understood several things simultaneously. She understood that Lucien Blackthorne did not make mistakes of impulse. She understood that whatever his reasons, and they were not nothing, a man like this did not cross a room without reasons, he had calculated the effect of this gesture with the same precision that he presumably brought to everything else. She understood that the room, which had gathered its collective breath, was about to exhale a story that would travel through every drawing room and dining table in London by Monday morning. She also understood, and this was the thing that steadied her hands, that pulled her spine straight, that transformed the quality of the smile she turned toward Isadora Pemberton Holt before looking back at the Duke, that for the first time in 4 months, she was not the one being looked through. "Of course," she said. And then, because she was Vivienne Ashcroft and some things could not be entirely suppressed, "You're forgiven." Something moved across Lucien Blackthorne's face that she might, under other circumstances and with more evidence, have identified as amusement. Isadora had gone very still. The room had not. 200 people were doing what 200 people in formal rooms always did when something significant happened in front of them. They were watching with the apparatus of people who were not watching, cataloging every detail, preparing the narrative that would exit with them through the front doors and distribute itself across the city like weather. Vivienne could feel it, the shift in the specific quality of attention she'd been receiving since she walked in, the way it had changed from the thing it had been, the pitying and the contemptuous and the quietly delighted, into something else entirely. They were not looking through her anymore. They were looking at her. Cedric Vane, from somewhere across the room, was also looking at her. She did not look back. She did not need to. Lucien offered her his arm with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who was accustomed to the gesture meaning something, and Vivienne put her hand on it, and they moved together through the room as though they had always been in the habit of doing so. The first quarter of an hour was a masterclass in controlled performance. Lucien guided them through the room with the navigational ease of someone who had spent a lifetime reading spaces, pausing at the exact clusters that would maximize the story's spread, not stopping long enough to invite interrogation, projecting the particular quality of attentiveness that communicated to anyone watching that the woman beside him had his complete interest. He introduced her to 2 men whose names registered as significant, even to Vivienne's limited catalog of political weight, and he did it in the tone of a man presenting someone who required no explanation. She matched him. She did not know how she knew to, but she did. The register of her voice, the angle of her engagement, the specific way she let silences sit without filling them. She had grown up in rooms like this. She understood their grammar even when she'd forgotten she did. Between conversations, in the small negative spaces of navigation, he spoke to her in a low and unbothered voice. "You're handling this better than most people would." "I have been handling things all afternoon," she said. "You've simply given me better material." He considered that. "You knew them well." The women in the sitting room. She turned her head to look at him. "You heard that?" "I arrived 10 minutes before I came in. I was managing my own assessment of the room." A pause. "Lady Constance Merryweather's husband owes 3 different creditors significant amounts. Her social cruelty is a form of territory defense. It's not personal." It felt personal. Most things do. When they're aimed at you, that doesn't make it about you. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. That's a very cold way to look at it. Yes, he agreed, entirely without apology. They accepted fresh champagne from a passing servant, and Vivienne drank some of hers this time, because the afternoon had reached a point where not drinking was its own kind of tension, and she was tired of managing unnecessary tensions. Why? She said. He did not ask her to clarify. Because you were about to leave, and leaving first is the only loss that can't be recovered from in a room like this. That's a reason for why it benefits me. It doesn't answer the question. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that the quiet was not evasion but assessment, the brief pause of someone deciding how precisely to be honest. I've been watching Duke and Vivienne operate in political spaces for 2 years. He's a man who confuses other people's tolerance for his limitations with approval of them. At some point, that produces consequences. He looked at her, and the quality of it was direct without being aggressive, the look of someone who expected their directness to be matched. You're not a pawn in those consequences. You shouldn't have to be treated like one at his wedding. She paused. That's more complicated than a simple reason. Simple reasons are for simple situations. They were near the windows now, the late afternoon light coming in from the west in the way that reduced everything to warmth and elongated shadows, and the room was behind them, and Vivienne was aware of the distance they'd traveled from the center of it, both literally and in some other register that was harder to name. She could see Kedrick at the far end, still receiving congratulations, but his body language had changed. The ease of it was slightly less easy. He had glanced in her direction 4 times in the last 30 minutes. She had counted without intending to. He's watching us, she said. I know. Does that have anything to do with why you're doing this? Lucian Blackthorne looked out the window at the grounds, where the white roses were beginning to lose their precision in the falling light. No, he said. And then, in the same uninfected tone, but it doesn't hurt. The thing about a lie told by omission is that it requires the architecture of the truth to support it. Vivienne had learned this over 3 years with Kedrick, the way a true thing, selectively presented, could become the scaffolding for a false one. She was practiced enough at recognizing the structure to understand that what Lucien had just said was probably true, and probably incomplete, and that the part he hadn't said was the part that mattered. She filed that away without comment. The afternoon moved into evening with the specific momentum of events that are managed by people who manage things professionally. Candles were lit at intervals that communicated intent. The string quartet shifted to something that would eventually support dancing. Food appeared on surfaces in arrangements that suggested abundance without effort. Vivienne ate something, finally, a small thing from a tray, because her body had been running on formality for several hours and was beginning to register a complaint. Through all of it, the room continued its work. She watched it operate from this new position. The position of standing beside someone who changed what you were in the room's collective accounting. Not because she had become different, because the room's information about her had changed, and rooms of this kind ran entirely on information. The women who had looked through her were now looking at her with the specific quality of recalibration, the updating of a file. The men who had ignored her were finding reasons to engage, because Lucian Blackthorne's sustained interest was a kind of currency, and proximity to currency attracted attention. It was, she thought, genuinely extraordinary how little it had to do with her. And yet, there was a conversation with a woman named Helena Cartwright, who designed something or funded something or possibly ran something. The details were unclear, but the quality of her attention was not. And who spoke to Vivienne for 12 minutes with the engaged intelligence of someone who had decided she was worth speaking to, and who asked 3 very sharp questions about the Ashcroft family's involvement in a particular land dispute that had occupied Parliament for the better part of a year, and who seemed to find Vivienne's answers genuinely interesting. That had nothing to do with Lucian. That was just a conversation. Afterward, when Helena Cartwright had moved on, Vivienne stood for a moment in the unusual sensation of having said something that someone had found worth hearing, and she noticed that Lucian had been watching the exchange from a slight distance, and that his expression, neutral as it reliably was, had a quality she couldn't immediately read, She's the Earl of Sutherland's sister, he said when she rejoined him. She manages 3 of his estates and significantly more of his political positioning than anyone officially acknowledges. She asked me about the Keswick land dispute. What did you say? I told her what I knew, which wasn't complete, but what I said was accurate. And she seemed to feel that what I said was useful. Vivienne considered this. Is she someone I should know? She's someone who should know you, Lucien said. There's a difference. Vivienne looked at him. He was watching the room with the expression of someone reading a text, and she had the unsettling sense, not for the first time that evening, that the afternoon had a shape she was only partly aware of, that whatever Lucien Blackthorne was doing involved a geometry she hadn't been given the full coordinates of. You're doing something, she said. I'm attending a wedding. You're doing something else. He turned his head to look at her, and the directness of it was the same directness it had been at the beginning, the same quality of assessment, the same lack of the usual social veneers. I told you it was a temporary arrangement. You told me it was to silence gossip around your family. That's accurate. What gossip? A pause that lasted just long enough to communicate that he had decided to answer, and that the decision was deliberate. My younger brother has been conducting a business arrangement with certain associates of Kedrick Vane's new family, the kind of arrangement that will become problematic when the Pemberton Holt accounts are examined more closely, which they will be. I am reducing exposure. Vivienne processed this. By appearing to have a connection to me, by being present in this room tonight in a way that is not associated with either party's financial interests. Your presence beside me establishes that. My presence beside you establishes that you're aligned with a woman who has no stake in either family's finances. Correct. And it also completely transforms my social standing at this event. That is a side effect. A convenient one. Yes, he said, simply, without pretense. She looked at him for a long moment. The honesty of it was almost more disorienting than a lie would have been. She was accustomed to people having reasons for the things they did on her behalf and concealing those reasons in the language of generosity. The bare presentation of the exchange, "You are useful to me, I am useful to you," was a different kind of thing entirely. "All right," she said. He nodded, as though something had been confirmed, and they returned to the room. The next hour produced several things of note. First, Marguerite reappeared, took in the situation, and had a very brief expression of profound confusion before composing herself into something like pleased vindication, which she wore for the rest of the evening and which Vivienne would have to account for later. Second, Helena Cartwright returned with a specific name, a solicitor who had been involved in the Keswick dispute, and asked whether Vivienne would be willing to meet with her the following week to discuss something related. Vivienne said yes. Third, Lord somebody whose name she caught as Ashworth drew Lucien into a conversation about a parliamentary matter of the kind that usually excluded her from any room she'd ever stood in, and Lucien did not exclude her. And Ashworth, after a moment of adjustment that was barely perceptible, included her, and she found herself 3 sentences into a genuinely substantive discussion about the mismanagement of a particular public works account before she entirely caught up to what was happening. The fourth thing, Kedrick Vane walked over. He approached in the manner of a man who had been constructing an approach for some time and had decided that the cost of not executing it was higher than the cost of the attempt. He was still with Isadora. Isadora was on his arm in the way of someone who had been informed this was happening and had determined to treat it as a victory lap. Blackthorne. He extended his hand to Lucien with the careful bonhomie of a man who was managing multiple things simultaneously. Glad you could make it. Vane. Lucien shook his hand once, briefly, with the economy of a man for whom the social performance of warmth was not required. Kedrick's eyes moved to Vivienne. They stayed there for a moment with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man recalculating, of someone who had filed something under a particular category and found the category was no longer accurate. Vivienne, he said. You look— She does, Lucien said. The sentence was unfinished. It was unfinished in the way of a door shut in someone's face. The absence of words completing it carried more than the words would have. Kedrick's expression went through a rapid series of adjustments. Isidore's grip on his arm tightened by a degree that only someone paying close attention would notice, and Vivienne was paying close attention. "We're glad you could both come," Isidore said, with the tone of a woman reasserting the shape of a conversation. "I hope the evening has been useful," Lucian said. "Thank you for the invitation." The word landed and he moved on, not aggressively, simply with the ease of a man for whom the conversation had concluded. And because Vivienne was on his arm, she moved with him, and she did not look back at Caedric Vane's face, but she heard, in the brief silence that followed, a sound she had not expected and could not immediately catalog. It was the sound of Isidora saying something low and direct to her new husband. It was the sound of a woman who had understood, in the space of a 2-minute exchange, that something had been established here that she had not planned for. Vivienne and Lucien reached a quieter corner near the east windows. The evening had fully settled outside, the grounds lit by lanterns that made the white roses into something more atmospheric than architectural, and the room behind them was in the middle phase of its own transition. That hour of a formal gathering where the structure loosens and the real conversations begin, the ones that don't have official versions. "You cut him off," Vivienne said. "He was going to say something about your appearance. Whatever he was going to say would have been either condescending or inappropriate." "You don't know that. I've been in rooms with Caedric Vane for 2 years. He picked up a glass from a nearby surface. I know exactly that." She was quiet for a moment. The evening had deposited her in a place she had not anticipated when she stepped out of her carriage 4 hours ago, and she was aware of the strangeness of it. The sense of having moved through her own life while simultaneously watching it from a slight remove, trying to understand which parts of what was happening were real. "What happens now?" she asked. "Not about tonight specifically." "Tonight ends," Lucian said. "We depart with appropriate visibility. The story spends the next 72 hours in circulation. Your social position improves. My brother's exposure is reduced. We have fulfilled whatever arrangement this was." "Whatever arrangement this was." "Unless you prefer a different characterization." She looked at him. "What would you characterize it as?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that was his specific brand of quiet. Not the quiet of someone finding words, but of someone measuring the accuracy of the ones they had. "A beginning," he said. "Possibly." She did not ask him what it was a beginning of. There was something in the way he'd said it. The precision of the possibly, the evenness of the tone, the complete absence of performance, that suggested the answer was not yet fully in existence, and that pressing it would produce something less true than leaving it to grow at its own rate. "I should find Marguerite," she said. "She's been watching us from the far table for 40 minutes. She'll survive another 20. Vivienne looked across the room and found Marguerite, who was indeed watching with an intensity that had shed any pretense of subtlety. "She's going to have questions." "Everyone's going to have questions." He said it without apparent concern. "That's rather the point." They remained at the window for another interval, speaking in the unhurried way of two people who had negotiated something and were now in the strange quiet on the other side of negotiation, where the terms are set and the shape of the thing becomes visible for the first time. He told her about Ashworth's involvement in a public works committee that would matter in 6 months. She told him what she knew about the Keswick land dispute that Helena Cartwright didn't already know, which was one precise thing that made him go slightly still in the way of someone encountering unexpected information. She noticed he did not explain why it made him still. She did not ask. When they finally moved to depart, the timing of it was as deliberate as everything else. The right moment, the right exit, the right configuration of public visibility. He escorted her to the entrance with the formality of a man who understood what gestures meant in formal rooms. The carriage was brought around. At the door he said, "I'll call on you, Tuesday, if that suits." "It suits," Vivienne said. "There are things it would be useful to discuss." "I imagine there are." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense that the thing she had noticed several times across the evening, the quality of his attention, the measuring of it, was in operation now at higher resolution. Then he said, with the same level register he used for everything, "You did well tonight." "So did you," she said. A very brief thing crossed his face that might have been a smile in a man less committed to restraint. She stepped into the carriage. The city moved past the window in its evening configuration, lanterns, foot traffic, the shapes of buildings settling into silhouette, and Vivienne sat with her hands in her lap and tried to understand what had happened to her afternoon. She had gone to witness her own worst story being told about her. She had come out the other side of something that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like the opposite of defeat. The carriage turned onto Belgrave Crescent, and she was nearly home, and she was thinking about Helena Cartwright and Lucian's expression when she told him the precise thing about the land dispute, and she was thinking about the beginning of whatever this was, and she was almost at the point of deciding what to think about all of it, when Marguerite's carriage pulled alongside hers. Marguerite rapped on the side of her own carriage, which slowed to match pace, and she leaned out the window with an expression of pure, uncontained urgency. "Vivienne." Her voice cut across the ambient city noise with the force of something compressed for 40 minutes and finally released. "I just received a message, forwarded from my contact at the Pemberton Holt firm." She held up a folded note. "You need to know what Cedric has done." The carriage wheels on cobblestones, the lantern light moving. "What is it?" Vivienne said. "It's not about tonight." Marguerite's face had shed its earlier vindicated satisfaction and replaced it with something that sat considerably closer to fear. "It's about money, Vivienne. It's about your father's accounts. Cedric, there are documents." The carriage stopped. The words in Marguerite's hand had nothing to do with tonight's performance, with any of the calculations Lucian had described, with the story the room would be telling by Monday morning. They had to do with something older, something that had been happening in the background of everything else, while Vivienne had been managing her grief and her composure and her dignified exits. The note was 3 lines. She read it twice in the stopped carriage on Belgrave Crescent, with the lamplight guttering and Marguerite watching her face. And Vivienne Ashcroft understood, with the bone-deep clarity of someone who has just found the bottom of something much larger than the surface suggested, that the event she had survived tonight was not, in fact, what she needed to survive. The note was written in a clerk's hand, the kind of precise, unhurried script that belonged to someone paid to record things accurately and instructed, on this occasion, to record something that was not supposed to exist. Vivienne read it a 3rd time. Then she folded it. "Where did this come from?" she said. Not a question. The flatness of her voice surprised her. Marguerite was gripping the edge of her carriage window with both hands, the cold air moving between them, the lamplights making unsteady shapes on the cobblestones. "My contact at the firm, Aldous Pemberton Holt's legal firm, the one that managed the merger of the Vane family interests. He forwarded it through an intermediary. He wouldn't attach his name to it. Vivienne, if what it says is accurate, it says Cedric redirected settlement funds from my father's estate." The words came out in the register of someone reading aloud from a document that concerned a stranger. 18 months ago, before the engagement ended." "Before he ended the engagement," Marguerite said, and the distinction landed the way she intended it to. Precisely, without cruelty. Because Marguerite was not cruel, only honest in the way of women who have watched other women refuse to be. The carriage horses shifted. A door closed somewhere on the crescent. "How much?" Vivienne said. "The figure on the note." "How much, Marguerite?" Her cousin exhaled. "Enough to have affected your father's decision to sell the Ashcroft property in Derbyshire. The timeline matches." A pause. "Vivienne, the sale happened 3 months before the letter arrived. The Derbyshire property, the one her father had called a difficult but necessary adjustment, the one that had aged him, visibly, in the months surrounding the transaction. The one Vivienne had accepted as part of the general contraction of the Ashcroft circumstances, the kind of loss that happened to families and was not any one person's fault. She looked at the folded note in her hands. The thing about discovering that you've been standing in someone else's construction is that the structure doesn't immediately collapse. You can feel it for a moment as both things simultaneously, the version you believed and the version that was true. And in that interval before the original version dissolves, you understand with absolute clarity the specific cost of having believed it. She had believed Cedric Vane was a man who had changed his mind about her. She had allowed herself, in the long months since the letter, to locate a version of that which contained the possibility of her own inadequacy, a thing she had not been entitled to want, a happiness she had not been constructed for. She had been careful not to say this to anyone, but she had thought it, and the thinking of it had done its work on her. She had not believed he was a man who had systematically extracted something from her family before severing the attachment. The two versions were so different that they required different words, and she hadn't yet found the right ones. "I need to speak to Lucien Blackthorne," she said. Marguerite blinked. "Tonight?" "No." She looked up at the sky, which was dark and unhelpfully neutral on the subject. "Tomorrow." "Vivienne, it's his brother's connection to the Pemberton Holt accounts that—" "I know what it is." She tucked the note into her wrap. "That's why I need to speak to him." She did not sleep well. This was not surprising. What was surprising was the quality of the wakefulness, not the restless turning of grief, which she knew, but something more focused, more cold. She lay in the dark of her room on Belgrave Crescent, and she thought about the timeline, the Derbyshire sale, the letter, the wedding, the 18 months that connected them, which she had walked through as a continuous landscape of misfortune and was now required to reread as a managed sequence of decisions made by someone who understood exactly what he was doing. The precision of it was the thing that kept her awake. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayal was common. She had always known this in the abstract. But the precision, the selection of the moment, the calculation that she would attribute her father's financial contraction to circumstance, that the sale would be absorbed into the general story of a family managing the pressures of the time, that no one would look at the timeline because no one would have reason to look unless someone specifically showed them what to look for. He had been correct. No one had looked. She had not looked. By 3 a.m, she had arrived at something that was not yet a plan, but had the early structural elements of one. By 5 she was dressed and had written 2 letters, one of which was to a solicitor her father had used before his death, and one of which she did not send and instead placed in the drawer of her writing desk. She would speak to Lucien first. Tuesday came with the particular quality of a day that had decided its own importance. The morning was gray and specific, not the vague gray of indecision, but the sharp gray of late October, which in England communicated a kind of honest bleakness that Vivienne had always found more manageable than false brightness. Lucien arrived at 10:30. She had arranged to receive him in the front sitting room rather than the drawing room, which was a minor signal, possibly one he would read, possibly one he would not. He came in wearing the same quality of controlled presence he'd carried into the Holt estate on Saturday. Not performed, simply structural, the way a building has weight without announcing it. He declined tea. He sat across from her with his hands resting on his knees, and the expression of a man who had come to receive information he had already estimated the shape of. "You know what I'm going to tell you," she said. "I know some of it." She produced the note. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move with the steady pace of someone reading for accuracy rather than surprise. And she watched him finish and set it on the table between them without immediate comment. "The timeline," he said finally. "Yes." "Your father's Derbyshire sale." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment in the way that was its own form of answer. "When did you first know the accounts were being managed by the Pemberton Holt firm?" "I didn't know." She looked at him directly. "My father handled his own affairs until 2 years before he died. He engaged a solicitor independently. I don't know how or when Kaedrick or his associates entered that arrangement. Someone brokered the introduction. That's what I need to find out." Lucien's eyes moved to the window. Outside, a carriage passed, and the sound of it filled the brief silence in the way ambient sounds sometimes did, not masking the quiet, just giving it texture. "My brother," he said, without inflection. "Is that a question?" "No." He looked back at her. "Edmund has been a peripheral participant in the Vane financial network for 14 months. I became aware of this 6 weeks ago. I have been managing the exposure quietly." A pause. "I did not know the network included your father's accounts." "But you knew there was a network." "I knew there were financial arrangements that would not survive examination." His voice was even, undefended. "I did not have the full architecture." The word landed. Architecture. The precise word for a system designed by someone who understood that individual components look like coincidence, and only the full structure reveals intent. You used our association on Saturday to create distance between yourself and the Pemberton Holt interests, Vivienne said. Yes. And now you know that those interests connect directly to my family's losses. Yes. The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, October did its work on the trees lining the crescent, and the light was the color of something ending. I am not your opponent in this, Lucian said. I know that. She said it without warmth, because warmth wasn't the point. But I need to understand what you know, and what you're willing to do, and whether those two things produce anything I can actually use. He looked at her for a moment, the measuring quality of it, the one she'd identified at the wedding as something between assessment and recognition. What do you want to do with it? I want to expose it. Exposing it damages Edmund. Edmund participated in financial fraud that affected my father's estate. She held his eyes. What would you have me do with that? He did not answer immediately. This was, she was beginning to understand, one of the things about him. The genuine pauses, the ones that meant the question was being taken seriously rather than processed through the usual social machinery. The machinery that produced, I understand your position and will find a way through this, and let's not be hasty. He didn't produce those things. He sat with the actual weight of what she'd said, and he looked at it. Edmund is 23, he said. Yes. He was recruited into this arrangement by men who understood exactly what they were doing and chose someone young and financially unsophisticated and ambitious enough to want what they were offering. I know. That doesn't exonerate him. No, she said. It doesn't. Another pause. What do you need from me? The question came out without qualification, and that was the thing. The absence of the conditional, the but, the however, the provided that. Just the question itself, asked in the tone of a man who had decided on a direction and wanted to know the specifics. Vivienne felt something in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, and was perhaps simply the unfamiliar sensation of being asked a direct question and permitted to give a direct answer. Documents, she said. Whatever your access to the Pemberton Holt network can produce. The brokers, the account transfers, the introduction of my father's solicitor into the arrangement. I need the full structure, not the individual pieces. That will take time. How much? 2 weeks. Possibly 3. In 3 weeks, Cadric and Isadora return from the continent. Once they're back in London, the social machinery resumes, and whatever they know about the note reaching me, and they will know the firm has enough people to track that, they'll begin managing it. Lucien's expression shifted by a degree that was not quite visible but communicated itself anyway. The fractional adjustment of a man who had just been reminded that the person across from him was not operating at his pace but at her own, and that her pace was faster than he'd assumed. 10 days, he said. Can you do it in 10 days? I can do it in 10 days. She nodded. Outside, the gray light had shifted to the specific quality of late morning, which in autumn meant the day had committed to itself. There's something else, she said. He waited. Kedrick knows about our association now. The room saw it Saturday. By Monday it was in circulation. Marguerite confirmed the pattern of where the story landed. She looked at him steadily. He'll assume it's strategic on my part. He'll begin looking for a way to frame it as manipulation, to make me the architect of something that damages him rather than the person who is damaged. Yes, Lucien said. He'll do exactly that. Which means before he can do that, someone will need to be in a position to make the alternative framing available before his takes hold. He looked at her with that quality of focus that she had stopped finding unnerving and started finding cautiously useful. You've thought this through. I had a long night. A very brief thing moved across his face, not a smile, but the shadow of the recognition that a smile would occur to a different man in this moment. Helena Cartwright, he said. She manages political positioning for Sutherland. If she has the accurate version of events before Kaedric's version circulates, she shapes what gets amplified in the right rooms. He nodded once, slowly. You want to meet with her. I already sent a note this morning. We're meeting Thursday. Lucienne looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize and had stopped trying to because his expressions operated in a register that required more data than she currently had. Good, he said. They sat in the quiet sitting room for a moment that held something neither of them elected to name. Not because naming it was dangerous, but because it was early, and they were both people who understood that premature precision was its own kind of inaccuracy. Then Lucienne said, "There's something I haven't told you." The quality of the silence changed. On Saturday, before I came into the room, he paused, and the pause was different from his usual ones. Shorter, less comfortable. I had a conversation with a man named Threlfall. He's a creditor, connected to the Pemberton Holt accounts through a third party that isn't publicly documented. He looked at her with the directness that was his baseline, but that now had an edge of something she read as deliberate. He mentioned your name. In what context? He was asking about your current financial position, whether you were solvent without the Ashcroft estate in full, whether your association with me was indicative of a financial need. The room was very still. He was checking whether I was vulnerable, Vivienne said. He was checking whether you were available, Lucian said. There's a difference, and it's the difference that concerns me. Threlfall doesn't collect vulnerability. He collects leverage. She understood what he was not saying. Not the gap between vulnerable and available as categories of assessment, but the specific implication that someone, before Saturday's performance at the Holt estate, before the note reached Marguerite, before any of the machinery of the last 72 hours had moved, someone had already been inquiring about her position. The architecture was larger than the note in her desk drawer. She and Kaedric had ended 4 months ago. Someone had been tracking her financial vulnerability for longer than that. Kaedric, she said. Threlfall works for more than one principal, Lucian said. But yes, that's the most probable reading. She sat with it. The sitting room. The gray light. The note in her desk drawer that she hadn't sent. The Derbyshire property and her father's expression in the month before the sale. The one she had attributed to pride in the difficulty of release and had never, not once, examined as the expression of a man who had discovered something he couldn't undo. Had her father known? Had he known in those last months that the contraction of their circumstances was not circumstantial? You think this is bigger than the estate accounts, she said. I think it's bigger than Kaedric, Lucienne said. The words settled. Outside, a carriage turned onto the crescent. Somewhere on the street, a voice said something ordinary, a direction given, an address called out, and the sound of it was almost offensive in its normalcy against the specific quality of what was happening in this room. Lucienne stood. He picked up the note, folded it, and returned it to her. I'll have what I can access in 10 days. His voice had returned to its operational register, the one without edges, the one that communicated logistics without effect. Don't meet with Helena Cartwright until I know what Threlfall's current position is. 1 week. Thursday is 4 days. 4 days to find out whether the conversation you have with Helena Cartwright on Thursday puts you in front of the problem or in front of a different one. She wanted to argue. She had the argument already formed. She was not a person to be managed. The Thursday meeting was her initiative, her pace was her own, and she looked at him and understood that he knew she had the argument and was not asking her to abandon it, but to hold it for 96 hours. And that this distinction was the difference between a man protecting an asset and a man protecting a person. 4 days, she said. He nodded. Then, at the door, the note your cousin received. The man who forwarded it. He paused. Find out whether he sent it on his own initiative or whether someone asked him to. The door closed. Vivienne sat in the sitting room for a long time after that, not moving, not looking at anything specific, only sitting with the new shape of what she was inside. She had arrived at the Holt estate on Saturday as a woman attending her own diminishment. She was leaving Tuesday morning as a woman who had stumbled into the edge of something she could not yet see the full outline of, something that had been moving for months or possibly years beneath the surface of the story she'd been told about her own life. The note had been sent to Marguerite, not to her, to Marguerite, who moved in the outer circles of the vain social network, who had produced the invitation to Saturday's event. whose connection to the Pemberton Holt firm through her contact was known to anyone who knew Marguerite at all. Someone wanted her to know about the accounts. Someone wanted her to know now. She pulled the folded note from her wrap and looked at it again. The clerk's handwriting, precise, unhurried, the script of someone recording something for a purpose. And then she saw it, the thing she had missed in the carriage, in the cold, in the shock of the first reading. The date on the note. Not the date of the account transfer, the date the note had been written. It was dated 6 days ago, 3 days before the wedding. Someone had known she would attend. Someone had prepared this in advance of the event. Someone had timed the delivery for the night of Cedric Vane's wedding, when her emotional state would be at its most compromised, when her judgment would be operating under the specific weight of a long and difficult day, when she would be most likely to act on what she received rather than examine it. The note was not a gift. It was a trigger. And somewhere in the city, the person who had pulled it was already watching to see what she'd do next. She spent the next 4 days doing what Lucien had asked her not to do. Not the Thursday meeting. She held that back. The 4 days, she gave him that. But she did not sit with her hands folded waiting for someone else's timeline to determine the shape of her own situation. She wrote to the solicitor. She wrote to a second solicitor, one her father had consulted briefly and then stopped consulting, the reason for which she had never known and was now beginning to suspect. She pulled the correspondence she had from the 18 months before the engagement ended and read it in sequence, in the way you read something when you are no longer reading for comfort but for evidence, and the texture of Cedric's letters, the warmth of them, the specific quality of his attentiveness during that period, took on a different character entirely when read against the backdrop of what someone was doing to her family's accounts during the same months. He had been very warm during that period. She had attributed it to the natural intensification of an attachment moving toward commitment. She understood now that warmth, like every other resource, could be deployed strategically, and that what she had felt as love had been, on his side of the equation, management. This did not destroy her. She noted that about herself with something approaching clinical interest. It should have been the kind of discovery that reorganized the foundations. And it did reorganize them, she was not pretending it didn't. But the reorganization produced not collapse, but a very specific kind of cold clarity. The sort that arrived when you had already done your grieving for the wrong thing and had no grief left to waste on the right one. On Thursday morning, 4 days after Lucien's visit, a message arrived at Belgrave Crescent. Not from Lucien, from Edmund Blackthorne. Potter. She read it standing in the entrance hall, still in her morning dress, the house not yet fully awake around her. It was short. It said, "I need to speak with you. Not my brother, you." It said, "I know what the note contained." It said, "There are things Lucien hasn't told you, and you need to hear them before Thursday." She turned the letter over. Nothing on the back, no address for reply, which meant he either expected an immediate answer or didn't want one traceable. She stood in the entrance hall for 60 seconds exactly. She counted, without knowing why she was counting, and then she sent a reply through the same messenger. This afternoon, 3 o'clock. Sobbed. Edmund Blackthorne was 23 and looked, in person, like the idea of Lucien produced by someone who understood the materials but had gotten the proportions slightly wrong. The same height, approximately. The same jaw. But where Lucien's face had that quality of controlled interior weather, Edmund's was fully exposed. The anxiety on it when he arrived at Belgrave Crescent at 3 o'clock was not something he was making any attempt to conceal, which told Vivienne something about the state he was in before she heard a word he said. She received him in the same front sitting room. She did not offer tea. She sat and she waited and she let the silence do its work, which was something she had learned from a man who used silence like a precision instrument. Edmund sat across from her. He put his hands on his knees and then moved them to the arms of the chair and then settled on his knees again. "You haven't told my brother I asked to meet you. I received your letter 4 hours ago. You should know." He stopped, started again. The way people started again when the rehearsed version had failed and they were attempting the unrehearsed one, which was always more accurate and more dangerous. "I should tell you that what I'm about to say, some of it implicates me directly. I'm aware of that. I'm not here because I think you'll protect me. I'm here because there's a specific thing happening right now that you're not seeing, and if you go into Thursday without seeing it, It will be too late to see it at all. What's happening on Thursday? He exhaled. Threlfall isn't Kaedric's man. He's not the Pemberton Holt firm's man either, not primarily. He works for a group of creditors, older money, the kind that doesn't appear in current accounts because it operates through proxies. And they've been managing a particular financial exposure in the Vane network for 2 years. He looked at her directly. The exposure includes my brother's assets. The sitting room was very quiet. Say that again, Vivienne said. Lucien has been managing what he thought was my exposure, a peripheral involvement in the Vane financial arrangements. He pulled back 14 months ago when I told him what I'd been involved in. He's been cleaning the edges of it since. Edmund's voice was steady now. The steadiness of someone who has crossed a threshold and found that the other side, whatever it contains, at least has solid ground. What he doesn't know is that his own assets were included in the original arrangement. Not recently. Before I was involved, 2 years before. Someone used his name, his accounts, his property holdings in the North, as collateral in a structured arrangement that he never agreed to and has never seen the documentation of. Vivienne did not move. Who? She said. Threlfall's principals. The older creditors. They did it because Lucien's name attached to the arrangement made it stable. His reputation for financial integrity made the other parts look legitimate. And they did it, Edmund said, with documents that Lucien himself signed. Not for this purpose. For other things, legitimate transactions over the previous decade, but the signatures were extracted, repurposed. Forged, Vivienne said, functionally. The signatures are real. The documents they appear on are not what he signed. She looked at him. And you know this because I saw them 8 weeks ago. Threlfall showed them to me as a demonstration of how thoroughly the arrangement was protected. He was telling me that pulling out wasn't an option, that my brother's assets were already embedded in the structure, that any attempt to expose the network would destroy Lucien along with everyone else. His jaw tightened. He was telling me to stay quiet. He was using my brother as the mechanism for my compliance. The light in the sitting room was the flat gray of late October afternoon, and it lay across everything with the impartiality of a thing that did not have opinions about what it illuminated. Vivienne sat with what Edmund had just said, and she built the architecture of it in her mind, the way Lucien had used the word architecture, and she had found it precise. Threlfall's principals had embedded Lucien's name in a fraudulent structure 2 years ago. They had recruited Edmund, young, ambitious, financially unsophisticated, into the network, knowing that Edmund's involvement would keep Lucien proximate, would give them a line of pressure to the one man whose interference they most needed to prevent. They had sent the note to Marguerite not as a gift to Vivienne, but as a move on the board, to activate Vivienne, to draw Lucien into open association with her, to surface his involvement in the investigation of the Vane network before he could control the terms of that surfacing. The note was not a trigger pointed at Kaedric, it was a trigger pointed at Lucien, and she and Lucien had both walked directly into the shape of it. My brother doesn't know any of this, Edmund said. He thinks he's been managing a contained problem with clean edges. He doesn't know his own name is in those documents. Why are you telling me? He looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen on a man's face in a very long time. Because he trusts you, Edmund said. He told me, not explicitly, Lucien doesn't do anything explicitly, but he told me the specifics of what you'd worked out together in a way that he doesn't tell me the specifics of anything. And because I've spent 8 weeks being compliant, and it has not made anything better, it has only made the architecture stronger, and I don't know what else to do except tell someone who might be able to do something with it. She looked at him for a long moment. This may destroy you along with the rest of it. I know. Your involvement won't be hidden if the full structure comes out. I know that. You came to me anyway. He met her eyes. Yes. She stood. She moved to the window and stood looking at the crescent outside, at the trees that had given up on their leaves, at the flat gray sky doing its flat gray work over everything. Her mind was running very fast in a very specific direction, and she was letting it run, not directing it yet, just letting it find its own edges. Threlfall's principals needed the investigation to surface Lucien before Lucien could expose them. That meant they needed Vivienne to go to Helena Cartwright on Thursday with enough of the story to make it public, which would trigger an examination of the Vane network, which would surface the documents, which would surface Lucien's name in the documents, which would accomplish in one movement what no direct action against the Duke of Blackthorn could have accomplished, the destruction of his reputation through the appearance of his own corruption. It was, she had to acknowledge in the cold and dispassionate part of her mind, an extraordinarily precise piece of work. She turned back to Edmund. "Does Threlfall know you're here?" "No." "Are you certain?" A pause that lasted one beat too long. "Reasonably." "Edmund." "I was followed on Tuesday," he said. "I don't believe I was followed today. I took significant precautions." She looked at him. "Significant precautions is not the same as certain." "No," he said. "It's not." She crossed to her writing desk. She wrote 2 lines on a card, folded it, and handed it to him. "You're going to leave through the servants' entrance on the east side of the building. You're going to give that card to whoever answers at the address on the front. You're not going to contact me again through written correspondence or messenger." She held the card out to him. "Can you do that?" He took the card, read the address, looked up at her. "This is Lucien's man." "His solicitor." "Yes." "You're telling Lucien." "I'm giving you 4 hours to tell him yourself before I do." She met his eyes directly. "That's all the time I have to give you. What you do with it is your own." Edmund stood. He held the card carefully, the way people held things when they understood they were the last in a line of decisions, when the card was not a card, but the compressed form of every choice that had brought them to a particular Thursday afternoon. "I should have told him 8 weeks ago." "Yes," Vivienne said. "You should have." He went. Okay. She did not go to the Thursday meeting. She sent a message to Helena Cartwright rescheduling for the following week, citing a private matter, and she spent the intervening hours doing what she did best, which was thinking clearly in conditions designed to prevent clear thinking. She pulled out every piece of correspondence she had. She laid out the timeline again: the Derbyshire sale, the letter, Kedrick's network, Threlfall's principles, Edmund's recruitment, Lucien's documents, the note to Marguerite, and she read it as a single sequence rather than a collection of separate events. And the shape of it was not what she had thought it was on Saturday, or on Tuesday, or even 3 hours ago. Kedrick was not the architect of this. He was a component, a useful and willing component, a man who had been offered access to a powerful financial network and had accepted without examining the full cost of the arrangement, but not the person who had designed the structure. He was the mechanism through which Vivienne's family had been accessed, and the mechanism through which Lucien's name had been brought proximate to the network. But the design was older and colder and more patient than anything Kedrick Vane was capable of. She was still sitting with this when Lucien arrived, not in the gentle way of a man who had received a card and was making a social call. He arrived with the quality of someone who had received information and had been moving since he received it, and the door to the sitting room opened with a precision that stopped just short of force. He stood in the doorway. She looked at him and understood from his face, from the specific quality of the control on it, the way it had gone tighter than his usual tightness, the way the lines of it had rearranged themselves into something that was not quite anger and not quite shock, but was somewhere between them where neither word was accurate enough, that Edmund had found him. "You knew before you told him to come to me," Lucien said. "I knew when Edmund told me." "Not before." He came into the room. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of it, and the quality of his presence was different from every other time she had been in a room with him. Not larger, not louder, but fundamentally less contained, the way a structure looks different when you can see the pressure it's under. "My documents," he said. "Yes?" 2 years. That's what Edmund was told. He turned away from her. He moved to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she watched the lines of his shoulders, and she did not say anything, because there are moments when the most useful thing is silence, and this was one of them. He had built his entire capacity for action on the assumption that his own foundation was clean. He had spent 14 months managing Edmund's exposure from that foundation. Everything he had done, the calculated presence at the Holt estate, the association with Vivienne, the 10-day timeline for documents, had been predicated on the belief that he was operating from solid ground. The ground was not solid. It had not been solid for 2 years. He turned back to face her. The control was back, or most of it. The practiced architecture of a man who had learned very early that losing your composure in a room was the same as losing the room. But the quality of it was different. It had cost something, the reassembling of it. She could see the cost. "The Thursday meeting," he said. "I canceled it." Something moved across his face. "You knew it was a trigger." "I worked it out after Edmund left. The note to Marguerite, the timing of it, the date it was written. Someone wanted me at Helena Cartwright before you had the documents, before you could control the narrative of what the documents contained. If you'd gone Thursday with what you had, your name would have surfaced in the examination before you could provide context for it." "Yes." She held his eyes. "I know." He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was the kind that contained a significant number of things that were not being said. "Then you protected me." "I canceled a meeting," she said. "Don't make it more than it is." "Vivienne." "I canceled a meeting because going to it would have been walking into someone else's plan, and I don't walk into plans I've identified." She looked at him steadily. "That's not the same as protecting you. That's protecting the investigation." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and she understood that he knew the distinction she was drawing was real, and also that he was not entirely convinced it was the complete truth, and that he was the kind of man who noted the gap between those two things and filed it for a time when it could be examined more carefully. "We need the documents," she said. "The actual documents, the ones with your signatures. Threlfall's principals have the originals, but there will be copies somewhere in the Vane network. Kedrick's solicitor, or one of the men in the financial arrangement, kept copies as insurance. That's how these structures work. You know how these structures work. My father's solicitor walked me through what he knew this morning. Not all of it. Enough." She stood. "Kedrick will be back from the continent in 6 days. Before he returns, we need to have the copy of those documents, and we need to have someone who can authenticate the forgery. Not a legal proceeding, not yet, but a person with sufficient standing to confirm what the documents are, so that when this goes public, the authentication is already in place." "That's—" He stopped. Looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and she catalogued it without immediately naming it, the way you catalog something you needed to examine more carefully. "You've been thinking about this since Edmund left." "I've been thinking about it since I read the date on the note." "That was 4 days ago." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and the sitting room held the sound of the city outside and the flat gray October light and the specific quality of two people who have arrived, without entirely intending to, at the edge of something that requires a decision neither of them has formally made. "If we do this," Lucian said, and the if carried the weight of a man who understood that the if was not really a question, "it will not be quiet. The principals will not accept exposure without retaliation. They'll go after everything. My reputation, your family, Edmund, whatever they can reach. I know. It will be public, and it will be ugly, and it will move faster than we can fully manage. I know that too. And you want to do it anyway." She looked at him, and the things she had been carrying since she stood in the corridor at the Holt estate and heard two women describe her suffering as a performance, since she read a letter that severed her from the future she had believed in, since she stood in a stopped carriage on Belgrave Crescent with a note in her hands that told her the story of her own loss had been written by someone else. That thing had reached its final form, and its final form was not rage, and it was not grief, and it was not the desire to see Kedrick Vane diminished or Threlfall's principles destroyed. It was simply the absolute refusal to allow anyone else to determine the shape of what happened next. "Yes," she said. "I want to do it anyway." Lucian looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "There's a man, a document examiner. He worked for the Crown's legal counsel for 12 years before he went independent. He can authenticate the forgery." "Can you reach him?" "I already sent a messenger." She stared at him. "Before I came here," he said, "when Edmund told me." "You'd already decided." "I had already decided," he confirmed. "I came here to tell you." The sitting room, the gray light, the trees outside stripped of everything unnecessary. "There's one more thing," Lucian said. His voice had changed register. Not much, a degree, but she had become precise about his registers, and the degree was significant. "Threlfall's principles. I know who they are. I've known for 6 weeks, and I didn't tell you because I thought the knowledge would make you a target before we were ready." She went very still. "One of them," Lucian said, "is your cousin Marguerite's husband." The world did not rearrange itself dramatically. It simply showed her in the flat and ordinary October light the piece she had been missing. The reason the note had gone to Marguerite. The reason Marguerite had produced the invitation to Saturday's event. The reason Vivienne had been in that room at all. The reason every piece of the last 6 days had moved with such precision. Not because someone was watching Vivienne from the outside, because someone had been inside from the beginning. She did not go to Marguerite. This was the first decision, and it cost her something she had not anticipated paying, not the loss of the relationship, which she had already begun to understand was not what she had believed it was, but the specific grief of realizing that the person who had sat across from her at tea for 3 years, who had known about the letter before Vivienne had finished reading it, who had held her hand in the carriage on the way home from the dressmaker's, had been positioned there, had been, in some proportion she could not yet measure, an instrument. How much Marguerite knew was a question she did not have the answer to. Whether the invitation to Saturday's event had been her own cruelty or managed cruelty, whether she had understood the note she forwarded or simply passed it, these were distinctions that mattered and that she could not make yet. What she could do was nothing, not contact, not confrontation, not the letter she drafted and destroyed twice in the hour after Lucian left, the one that started with "I know" and ended with nothing adequate. She put Marguerite in a drawer of her mind and turned the key, and did not open it again. The 6 days before Cadrick's return from the continent moved with the specific quality of time under pressure, each hour granular and distinct, each decision load-bearing. Lucien's document examiner, a man named Corvin, mid-50s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent a career distinguishing real things from false ones, came to Belgrave Crescent on Friday and spent 4 hours with copies of 3 documents that Edmund had accessed through channels Vivienne elected not to ask the specifics of. Corvin worked in silence, with instruments she didn't recognize, and at the end of the 4 hours he sat back in his chair and said, with the effect of a man reporting a weather observation, "The signatures are authentic. The documents they appear on were assembled afterward. The paper stock is wrong by approximately 18 months. The ink distribution on the signature lines is inconsistent with the surrounding text. It's well done," he added. "Someone who knew what they were doing. But it's not clean enough to survive proper examination." She asked him to put that in writing. He did. She gave the written assessment to Lucien's solicitor and kept a copy in the locked drawer of her writing desk, beneath the letter she hadn't sent to Marguerite. On Saturday, Lucien came. He came in the way he always came, without the social performance of arrival, simply present in the room before she'd fully registered the transition. He looked like a man who had not slept well and was not going to discuss that. He sat across from her and put 3 sheets of paper on the table and said, "The copies are from a man named Alderson, who served as secondary solicitor to the Vane financial arrangements and kept documentation as personal insurance. He's willing to provide a statement. He's not willing to appear publicly. That's enough for now." "Alderson," she said, "the same firm as Marguerite's contact." "Different position. Alderson is older, more careful. He saw the full structure before the younger men were brought in." She looked at the 3 sheets. Account transfers, names, dates, the precise and unhurried language of someone recording something for a purpose that might one day be its own defense. "This covers my father's accounts. And 4 others. Your father's was not the only family accessed this way. He was the most recent." Lucian's voice was level. "The principals have been operating this structure for nearly a decade." A decade. The word landed with the weight of its own duration. 10 years of this particular architecture, 10 years of selected families, selected solicitors, selected young men like Edmund who could be recruited and controlled. The Ashcroft accounts were not a unique cruelty. They were a standard component. She found this, somehow, more enraging than the personal version. "Cadrick returns Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday evening." Threlfall will have told him about Edmund's disappearance from the network by now. He'll know something has shifted. He'll know, Lucian agreed. He won't know the shape of it. He'll move fast when he does. She looked up from the papers. The public accusation you mentioned, in the summary we were working from. He'll use the association between us, claim I'm manipulating you for social position, that the investigation is manufactured to protect myself. He'll need a venue for that claim, a room with sufficient audience. Helena Cartwright's event next Thursday. She had confirmed the rescheduled meeting 48 hours ago. It's not private. There will be 30 people there, minimum. If K. Edric has returned and has been briefed by Wednesday evening, he'll have Thursday morning to prepare something. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Then we need to be prepared for Thursday to become the venue rather than the approach. We need to be prepared for Thursday to become everything, she said. He looked at her with the quality of attention that had ceased to unsettle her and had become instead something she navigated by. The directness of it, the absence of the usual filters. What do you want to walk in there with? The full structure. Corvin's authentication, Alderson's account transfers, and Edmund. Something moved across Lucian's face. Edmund agreed. I asked him yesterday. He said yes. She held Lucian's eyes. He's the only person in the room who participated directly and can speak to the recruitment mechanism. Without him, the documentation is facts. With him, it's a human account of how this operates. That's the difference between information and understanding, and it's the difference that matters in a room full of people who make decisions based on what they believe. He's 23 and he's confessing to financial participation in a fraudulent network. In a room, not a courtroom. Not yet. She paused. It's the difference between being defined by what he did and defining himself by what he chose to do when he had the chance. Lucian said nothing for a moment. Then, you told him that. I told him the truth. He looked at her, and the thing that moved across his face was the same thing she had catalogued 3 days ago and not yet named. And she was closer to naming it now, but she still wasn't ready, because naming things before they were fully formed was a way of making them into something smaller than they were. Thursday, he said. Thursday. No. Wednesday arrived with the cold specificity of a day that has been building. Kedrick Vane returned to London at 7:30 in the evening. Vivienne knew this because she had asked someone to know it, and the someone, a man connected to Lucian's household whose function she understood to be information management, confirmed it by messenger at 8:15. Kedrick was at the Vane townhouse in Mayfair. He had received a visitor at 9 o'clock. The visitor had stayed 40 minutes. She did not need to be told the visitor's name. She slept 4 hours. Not from peace, but from discipline. The body required a minimum of function, and she had work tomorrow that required her functional. She was dressed and at her writing desk by 6. At 7, a message arrived from Lucian. 3 words. Threlfall moved last night. She sat with those 3 words and let them reconfigure her timeline. Not with panic. Panic was a luxury she had stopped affording herself somewhere in the middle of the last 10 days, but with the cold adjustive attention of someone who has planned for the contingency and is now executing it. She sent 4 messages, 1 to Corvin, 1 to Alderson's intermediary, 1 to Edmund, 1 to Helena Cartwright, which said only, I need an hour before the other guests arrive. It's not a request. Helena Cartwright sent back, 8 o'clock, come alone. Helena Cartwright's Kensington house was the kind of house that communicated its owner's position without requiring any visible effort, which was itself a form of effort, the most expensive kind. She received Vivienne in a morning room that looked out on a garden in the specific stage of autumn where it had given up pretending and committed to stark, and she poured coffee herself without asking, and she sat across from Vivienne with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation to become what it was always going to become. Vivienne gave her the full structure in 22 minutes. She did not soften it. She did not provide editorial commentary on the people involved. She presented it the way Corvin had presented his findings, with the affect of someone reporting observable fact. And she put the 3 documents and the authentication on the table, and she let Helena Cartwright read them in silence. Helena read without expression. She turned pages with the unhurried attention of someone for whom information was the primary currency and rushing it was its own form of waste. When she finished, she set the documents down and looked at Vivienne and said, "Who else knows the full shape of this?" Lucian Blackthorne, his brother, Corvin, who did the authentication, Alderson, who provided the account transfers. She paused. And whoever Threlfall briefed last night. Helena's eyes sharpened. Threlfall moved. Yes. Which means Kaedric has something prepared for this morning. That's my assessment. Helena was quiet for a moment in the way of a woman running calculations. He'll bring it to the room. He'll make the accusation publicly before you can present the documentation so that your presentation becomes a response to his accusation rather than an independent exposure. It makes you reactive. It makes the documentation look defensive. Yes. And you want to prevent that. I want to make it irrelevant, Vivienne said. There's a difference. Helena looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone revising a category. What do you need from me? The room to be structured differently than Kaedric expects. He'll expect to arrive and find a social gathering he can perform for. He needs audience before he makes his move, and he needs the audience to receive his version first. She met Helena's eyes directly. I need the first 30 minutes to run differently. Helena nodded slowly. I can do that. And I need Edmund Blackthorne to be able to speak when the moment comes, without the room dismissing him as interested party. That's harder. I know. But not impossible. Helena picked up her coffee. If he's introduced correctly, a pause, the kind that contained a decision being made. There's a man who will be here this morning, Lord Ashworth. You met him at the Holt estate. He chairs the private accounts committee. If Edmund's account is received by Ashworth first before the room's general interpretation settles, can you arrange that? I can put them in adjacent chairs and ensure Ashworth is paying attention before the morning properly begins. She set down her cup. Miss Ashcroft, if this goes the way it might go this morning, it will not be a comfortable event. No, Vivienne agreed. It may become something that requires people to choose sides in a room that generally prefers not to have sides. Yes. You're prepared for that. Vivienne thought about the corridor at the Holt estate 3 weeks ago and the two women whose voices had carried through the partially open door. She thought about the note folded in the stopped carriage. She thought about her father's face in the month before the Derbyshire sale, the expression she had spent 2 years misreading. I've been prepared for that for a long time, she said. I just didn't know what I was preparing for. The guests began arriving at 9:30. Vivienne stood near the east window of Helena Cartwright's drawing room and watched the room fill with the slow accumulation of people who had been told this was a morning gathering of the usual kind and were behaving accordingly. The movements of people who had not yet been told they were at an event. Lord Ashworth arrived at 20 minutes to 10 and was guided, with Helena's imperceptible efficiency, to a position near the fireplace where Edmund Blackthorne was already standing. She watched them begin to speak. She watched Ashworth's posture shift from polite to attentive within 3 minutes, which told her Edmund was executing. Lucian arrived at 10 exactly. He moved to her side without the performance of greeting, and they stood together at the east window with the quiet of two people who have run out of things to plan and are now simply in it. Threlfall is outside, he said quietly. He arrived 20 minutes ago. He hasn't come in. He's waiting for Kaedric. Yes. They'll come in together. Kaedric wants the entrance. He'll have it. Lucien's voice was even. Let him have it. She looked at him. You're calm. I'm not calm, he said. I've simply decided that the alternative is not useful. She looked at his face, the controlled lines of it, the specific quality of the stillness, which she understood now was not the absence of feeling, but its compression, the way pressure made materials denser and therefore harder. And she thought about what it cost a man like this to discover that his own name had been used, that the foundation he had built on had been compromised before he built on it, and to still be standing in a room on Thursday morning having made the decisions he'd made. Some people became diminished by the discovery that the world was more corrupt than they'd believed. Some people became something else. Whatever happens in the next hour, she said quietly, don't. I'm not going to say something sentimental. Then go ahead. Whatever happens, you didn't have to put Edmund in front of Ashworth this morning. You didn't have to let him speak. Lucien was quiet for a moment. He's my brother. He participated in a network that forged your name to documents and used you as collateral to control him. You would have been entitled to a different response. Entitled, he said, with a faint quality of something that wasn't quite bitterness. Probably. He looked at the room. He was 22 when they recruited him. He came to me when he found the shape of it. Those are the facts that matter. Some people wouldn't think so. Some people, Lucien said, let what they're entitled to become more important than what they can actually live with. He turned to look at her directly. I can't live with leaving him to this alone. The entitlement is irrelevant. The door opened. Kedrick Vane walked into Helena Cartwright's drawing room with Threlfall behind him and the specific quality of a man who has chosen his entrance and is executing it, and the room registered his presence with the slight atmospheric shift of a gathering that has been joined by someone who intends to determine its direction. He looked across the room and found Vivienne immediately. The look was not accidental. He had looked for her first, and finding her confirmed something, and the confirmation produced a small, controlled adjustment in his expression that anyone less practiced at reading rooms would have missed. Then he saw Lucien. The adjustment reversed. He had not expected Lucien. He had expected Vivienne, perhaps with documentation, perhaps with Helena Cartwright's backing. He had prepared for a narrative in which Vivienne was the aggressor, and Lucien was the collateral damage of her ambition. He had not prepared for Lucien standing at the east window with the ease of someone who had arrived first and found the position sufficient. The next 8 minutes were social in form and a different thing entirely in substance. Kedrick moved through the room with the working efficiency of someone deploying charm as infrastructure. He spoke to 3 people, laughed at something with a 4th, positioned himself near the center of the room with the practiced instinct of a man who understood that rooms had centers and that occupying them was its own form of argument. Threlfall took a position near the door. Lord Ashworth, Vivienne noticed, had moved slightly away from Edmund and was watching Kedrick with an expression she couldn't fully read from across the room. Then Kedrick spoke to the room. He did it in the way of a man who has decided that the social form of an announcement is more powerful than a confrontation. The voice lifted slightly, the quality of address shifting from conversation to declaration, the way a room full of people recognized without being told that they were now audience rather than participants. I want to address something directly, he said, because I think directness is more respectful than allowing rumors to do damage without being examined. He looked across the room at Vivienne with the expression of a man performing reluctant honesty. There are documents circulating, documents that purport to show financial irregularities in the Vane network. I want to say clearly, in this room, with these people present, that those documents are being used instrumentally by someone who has personal reasons to damage my reputation and who has enlisted the Duke of Blackthorn's name and influence to give that campaign the appearance of legitimacy. The room went very still. Miss Ashcroft, he said, and the name landed with the weight of a verdict, has experienced personal disappointment. I understand that. I'm not without sympathy for what she's carried, but sympathy doesn't require me to stand by while a private grievance is dressed up as public interest and weaponized against people who have done nothing but conduct legitimate business. He stopped. The room was perfectly, attentively silent. Vivienne looked at him across the length of Helena Cartwright's drawing room and the things she had carried for 3 weeks. Through the corridor at the Holt estate and the stopped carriage and the sitting room and 4 days of careful preparation and 1 sleepless Wednesday night, reached its final point of compression, the moment before a structure either collapses or holds. She did not look at Lucien. She did not need to. She looked at Kedrick Vane, and she said, in a voice calibrated to carry to every person in the room without rising above the register of absolute composure, "You're right that I have personal reasons. My father's estate lost a significant sum 18 months before you ended our engagement, through a redirection of settlement funds that passed through the Pemberton Holt Financial Network, the same network you joined 14 months before that letter arrived." She kept her eyes on him. "You're also right that there are documents. I'd like Lord Ashworth to look at them." The name landed the way she intended, not as a threat, but as a structure. Ashworth was already moving. Kedrick's composure did not collapse. He was too practiced for collapse, but it shifted. The specific shift of a man who had expected one configuration and encountered another, who had prepared for a defensive response and found an offensive one, and who was now running the rapid recalculation of someone who realizes the ground he stood on is different from the ground he mapped. Threlfall moved from his position near the door. And Edmund Blackthorne said, from his position near the fireplace, clearly and without hesitation, "I can explain the recruitment mechanism. I was part of it." The room did not make a sound. Kedrick turned to look at Edmund, and the look on his face in that moment, before the composure reasserted itself in the raw half-second of unguarded response, was not anger. It was not guilt. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that someone he believed was managed had chosen, against every calculation, to be something else. And in that half-second, across the silent room, Vivienne saw Threlfall reach into his coat. Not for a document. Lucienne saw it too. His hand closed on her arms, not pulling her, just the specific pressure of a man making a decision in the fraction of a second available for it. And his voice came out low and direct, and with the absolute steadiness of someone who has spent a lifetime refusing to let a room see him broken. "Ashworth. Now." Threlfall had a letter. That was what he'd reached for. Not a weapon in the physical sense, but the other kind. The kind that had been doing damage in this city for a decade without requiring anything as direct as violence. He produced it from his coat with the controlled deliberateness of a man who had prepared for this moment and believed the preparation was sufficient, and he held it up for the room with the expression of someone releasing something that could not be recalled. "This is a signed statement," he said, "from the Duke of Blackthorne's own solicitor, not the current one, the man who held the position 4 years ago, confirming the Duke's direct participation in the structured arrangement that Miss Ashcroft is attempting to characterize as fraud." The room made a sound that was not quite a sound, the collective intake of 30 people processing a detonation. Lord Ashworth had the documents Vivienne had brought. He had been reading them with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was holding had implications that extended well past this morning gathering in Kensington. He looked up from the documents when Threlfall spoke, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been handed two contradictory things and is deciding which one is real. Lucien's hand was still on Vivienne's arm, the light pressure of it, and she felt through that contact the moment he made his decision, not in words, not in any visible change of posture, but in the quality of stillness that preceded a man choosing to stop managing a situation and simply enter it. He released her arm. He walked across the room to Threlfall, and he held out his hand for the letter with the directness of a man who had decided that the distance between himself and the thing being used against him was a distance he was no longer willing to maintain. Threlfall held it a moment longer than he should have. Then he gave it. Lucienne read it standing. The room watched him read it with the held attention of 30 people who understood they were witnessing something that would determine what the next version of events looked like. His face was entirely still. Whatever the letter contained, whatever version of his name and his history it assembled, he read it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Complete, unrushed, accurate. When he finished, he lowered it and looked at Threlfall. "James Corrigan left my employ in 1887, he said. "He left because I discovered he had been providing documentation about my financial arrangements to third parties without my knowledge or consent. I have the correspondence confirming his termination and the reasons for it." He paused. "I also have, as of this week, a document examiner's written assessment confirming that 3 instruments bearing my signature were repurposed, assembled around signatures extracted from legitimate transactions, to create the appearance of participation in an arrangement I had no knowledge of." The room was very quiet. "A man who was already compromised," Lucien continued in the same even register, "is not a credible source for a signed statement. What he is a documented participant in the mechanism that produced the fraudulent instruments." He looked at Threlfall with the specific quality of a man who has decided that social distance is no longer a courtesy he owes. "You know this. You commissioned the statement knowing Corrigan's position made it legally worthless. You brought it here anyway because you needed 30 seconds of impact, enough time for the accusation to land before the room could examine it. Threlfall's face underwent a rapid and not entirely controlled series of adjustments. The architecture of the morning had shifted under him, and he was a man whose power operated through the management of information, and the information was no longer moving in the direction he had built the morning around. "Edmund," Vivienne said. Edmund Blackthorne moved from the fireplace to the center of the room with the specific quality of a young man who has spent weeks being afraid of this moment, and has discovered, in the arrival of it, that the fear was survivable. He was pale. He held himself with a straightness that cost him something visible. He looked at Lord Ashworth, and he said, "I was recruited into the Vane Financial Network 22 months ago by a man who represented it as a legitimate investment arrangement. Within 6 months, I understood it was not legitimate. Within 8 months, I had seen the instruments bearing my brother's name. I was told that any attempt to withdraw or to expose the network would result in those instruments being made public, with my brother's reputation as the primary damage." He paused. "I stayed compliant for 8 weeks after I saw those documents. I'm not asking anyone in this room to excuse that. I'm telling you what happened so that the mechanism is on record in front of witnesses." Ashworth set down the documents he'd been holding. He looked at Edmund for a long moment with the expression of a man who has dealt with institutional corruption long enough to recognize the specific texture of someone who has decided that the cost of silence has exceeded the cost of speaking. "Who are the principals?" Ashworth said. Edmund named 3 men. The room received each name with a different quality of silence. One name produced a visible reaction in a man near the window that was not shock but the specific quality of confirmation. The thing you feel when a thing you suspected is given form. The third name was Marguerite's husband. Cedric Vane had not moved from his position near the center of the room. He had stood through all of it with the composure of a man who understood that movement was its own form of admission, and he had watched the morning structure dismantle itself around him with an expression that had gone through several phases and arrived at something Vivienne could not immediately name. She named it eventually. It took her a moment because she had not expected to see it on his face. It was exhaustion, not defeat in the dramatic sense, not the collapse of a man who has been beaten and knows it. Something quieter. The exhaustion of someone who has been maintaining a particular construction for a very long time and has arrived at the moment when the energy required to maintain it exceeds what is available, and the construction simply stops. He looked at her across the room. She looked back. "Was any of it real?" she said. She said it quietly, not for the room. For herself, for him, for the specific question that 3 years of her life had become in the last 3 weeks. He held her eyes. "Some of it," he said. "Which part?" A pause that contained a man deciding whether honesty was something he still had access to, whether the mechanism of it still functioned after years of disuse. "The beginning," he said finally. "Before Aldis's people made me an offer, I didn't have the... Before I made a decision I can't undo." She looked at him for a moment longer. The beginning. Before the managed warmth and the redirected accounts, and the letter that severed her from a future while his associates were already reshaping the ground under her family. The beginning, which was either real or the most elaborate component of the construction, and which she would probably never be able to verify, and which she had decided, somewhere in the long nights of the last 3 weeks, she was not going to spend the rest of her life trying to. "I know," she said. And she did. She knew it with the same cold accuracy she'd brought to every other piece of this. Some of it had been real. Some of it had been a man choosing convenience over integrity at a specific juncture and then spending the subsequent time maintaining the choice rather than examining it. These 2 things could both be true. She turned away from him, not with anger, which would have required energy she had already spent, and not with forgiveness, which was not something that existed in the form of a decision made in a public room. With the simple completion of having looked at something long enough to understand it, and having understood it, choosing to look at something else. The morning ended over the course of an hour that felt like a different kind of time entirely. The slow, particular time of an event that has produced its consequences and is now in the process of absorbing them. Ashworth spoke quietly with two other men for 20 minutes and produced a set of commitments that Vivienne understood to be the beginning of a formal process, not the process itself. Threlfall left without his letter. She watched him go and noted that his posture, which had entered the room with the ease of a man who believed he was holding the decisive instrument, had undergone a recalibration that communicated itself in his shoulders and in the specific deliberateness of a man choosing not to show that he was calculating his next move. He would have a next move. She was not naive about that. The principals were not people who accepted a single morning's reversal as terminal, but the morning had changed what was available to them, had shifted the information landscape in which they operated, and Ashworth's involvement meant that what happened next would happen with a degree of institutional attention that the network had successfully avoided for nearly a decade. It was not over, but the shape of it had changed. Edmund found her near the window as the room thinned. He looked like someone who had set down a significant weight and was still calibrating how to stand without it. "Ashworth wants a full statement," he said. "Formal, with documentation. Will you give it?" "Yes." He said it without hesitation, which told her the decision had been made before he arrived, and the morning had simply confirmed it. "There will be consequences. Probably." "Lucien's not—" He stopped, started again. "He told me last night that whatever the formal process produces, it produces. That he wasn't going to manage the outcome on my behalf." "That sounds like him." "It's the right thing to say." A pause. "It's also the hardest thing I've ever heard him say." She looked at Edmund and she thought about the specific difficulty of watching someone you've damaged choose not to protect you from the damage, and how that choice, the refusal to absorb consequences that belong to someone else, was its own form of love, the kind that required more from the person exercising it than the easier version. "He'll be there," she said. "When it gets difficult. He just won't stand in front of it for you." Edmund nodded slowly. "I know." He looked at her. "Thank you. For the 4 hours." She understood what he meant. The 4 hours she'd given him to find Lucien himself before she would have sent the card. The small window of agency in a situation that had otherwise removed most of his. "It was the right amount of time," she said simply. He left. Mutt. She found Lucien in Helena Cartwright's garden. He was standing at the far end of it, in the section that had fully committed to November, the bed stripped and dark and settled into the particular dignity of things that have let go of their season. He had his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at nothing specific, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. The specific quality of a man alone with his own interior, not performing the management of it. She walked to where he was and stood beside him, and they stood in the cold for a moment without speaking, the way two people stand when the language of the last several weeks has been so concentrated and precise that silence is the only thing that doesn't feel like a reduction. "Corrigan," she said eventually, "I knew he'd been compromised when I let him go. I didn't know the extent." He looked at the stripped garden. "I should have." "You couldn't have anticipated the specific use." "No, but I could have been more thorough about the exposure when I ended his employment." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing about incomplete actions. They don't stay incomplete. They become someone else's tool." She understood that he was not talking only about Corrigan. He was doing the thing she had watched him do across the last 3 weeks, the precise, unsentimental examination of his own decisions, the refusal to assign blame externally for things that had a component of his own making. It was one of the things about him that she had found most disorienting in the beginning and had come to find most essential. He did not excuse himself. He also did not collapse under the weight of his own accounting. "You held the room," she said. "You built the case that made holding the room possible." "We built it." He turned to look at her, and the quality of it was different from the measuring attention she had catalogued in the beginning. The assessment, the calculation of the shape and weight of what was in front of him. This was something that had come after the measuring, something that had grown in the space where the assessment had concluded and found what it was looking for. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I said at the wedding, that it was a beginning." "I remember." I said possibly. "I remember that too." He looked at her with the full steadiness of a man who had learned, somewhere in the architecture of his life, to be very careful about certainty. and who had arrived through the specific events of the last 3 weeks, at a place where the carefulness remained but the certainty was no longer something he was willing to defer. "I want to remove the possibly," he said. The garden was very quiet. The cold air moved between the bare branches of the things that had let go of their season, and the sky above Kensington was the gray of something that has decided what it is. And Vivienne Ashcroft stood in it with the full understanding that the person beside her was not a man who said things for effect, and that the removal of a single word from a sentence he had spoken 3 weeks ago in a crowded ballroom carried the same weight as a declaration from anyone else would carry with 300 words behind it. "Lucienne," she said. "Yes." "The last 3 weeks have been—" "Yes," he said again. "I know. I'm not the same person who walked into the Holt estate." "No." He looked at her. "Neither am I." She thought about that. The specific truth of it. The way the last 3 weeks had not broken anything she needed, but had stripped away several constructions she had been maintaining without examining. The idea of herself as someone whose value was subject to the assessment of rooms. The idea of grief as something to be managed rather than moved through. The idea that the woman in the corridor swallowing things was the version of herself she was required to be. She was not that woman anymore. She was not entirely certain what woman she was instead, but she understood, with the same cold accuracy she'd brought to the account transfers and the forged documents and the timed note, that the uncertainty was not a problem. It was the first honest condition she'd inhabited in a very long time. "There will be a formal process," she said. "Ashworth's committee. It will take months. Kedrick will have solicitors. Threlfall's principals will fight." "Yes." "It will not be quiet." "No," he agreed. "It won't." He looked at her with the directness that had ceased to function as assessment and operated now as something she did not have a more precise word for than simply his attention, the full and unguarded quality of a man who had decided to stop keeping the people he valued at a manageable distance. "I'm aware of all of that. And none of it changes what I said." She looked at him for a long moment in the bare November garden, the stripped and honest garden that had given up its pretenses for the season, and she thought about what it meant to choose a person in the specific conditions of aftermath, not in the warmth of uncomplicated beginning, not in the easy terrain of people who have not yet revealed their damage to each other, but here, in the cold, with every difficult thing already visible. This was what it actually looked like, she thought. Not the version constructed in drawing rooms and social performances. The real version. 2 people who had seen each other operate under pressure, had watched each other make decisions and bear the cost of them, had built something in the specific crucible of the last 3 weeks that had no precedent in either of their histories. That was not a comfortable foundation. It was, possibly, the only kind that held. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "Remove it," she said. "The possibly." Something moved across his face that was not the shadow of a smile this time, but the actual thing. Brief, unguarded, the expression of a man who has spent a significant portion of his life in the careful management of what he allows to show, and who has decided, in this particular moment, in this particular garden, that the management is no longer the point. He offered her his arm. The same gesture as the Holt estate 3 weeks ago, with the same formality. But the content of it was entirely different, because the content of everything was different now, and they both knew it. She put her hand on it. They walked back through Helena Cartwright's bare November garden toward the house, where the morning's consequences were settling into the particular quiet of things that have detonated and are now simply true. And the city beyond the garden walls was doing what cities did, continuing indifferent, full of its own motion. And Vivienne walked through it with the specific sensation of a woman who has arrived, after a very long route, at something that is entirely her own. The weeks that followed were not easy. She had known they wouldn't be. Ashworth's committee opened a formal inquiry in the 2nd week of November. The documentation was presented, examined, and authenticated through channels that moved with the deliberate pace of institutional processes. Slower than a morning in a drawing room, more durable. Threlfall's 3 principals were identified formally. 2 retained solicitors immediately. The third, a man whose name had produced the strongest reaction in Helena Cartwright's room, resigned from 2 committees before he was asked to. Kedrick Vane's financial arrangements were examined in a separate process that ran parallel to the inquiry. He was not charged. The specific nature of his participation, the ways in which he had been a component rather than an architect, made the legal position complicated in the way that legal positions are always complicated when the truth has several layers. What happened to him was different from legal consequence, and in some ways more complete. The room's assessment of him changed, and rooms in this city operated on their assessments the way other mechanisms operated on harder currency. Isadora Pemberton Holt had a conversation with her father in the 3rd week of November that no one outside that room was present for, and the results of it were visible in the way the Vane household conducted itself in the months that followed. Marguerite came to Belgrave Crescent in the 1st week of December. Vivienne received her. She had thought about whether to, and had decided that not receiving her was its own kind of decision, one that closed something before she understood its full shape. Marguerite sat in the front sitting room, the same room where Vivienne had received Lucien and Edmond and made the decisions that had determined the structure of the last 6 weeks. And she looked like a woman who had come to account for something and was not certain she had the currency to do it. "I didn't know what was in the note," Marguerite said. "I want you to know that." "I believe you," Vivienne said. And she did. She had examined the question carefully enough to arrive at a genuine answer rather than a convenient one. "I knew Gerard had interests connected to the Vane network. I didn't know—" She stopped. "I didn't ask. I should have asked." "Yes," Vivienne said. "You should have." The honesty of it sat between them without softening, which was the only way honesty of that kind could sit. Marguerite had not been complicit in design. She had been complicit in the way that people were complicit when they chose not to examine the things happening in their peripheral vision because examination might cost them something they were not ready to pay. Vivienne understood this mechanism. She had used it herself, on the Derbyshire sale, on the quality of Kedrick's warmth during the 18 months she now understood differently. The difference was that Marguerite's not examining had served someone else's purpose, and the serving of it had cost Vivienne's family a significant sum and cost Vivienne 3 years of a life she had believed in. "I don't know what we are now," Marguerite said. "I'm not asking you to tell me. I just needed to come." Vivienne looked at her. "I know," she said. "I don't know either, but I think it's better to not know together than to decide in advance." It was not reconciliation. It was not severance. It was the honest admission that some things required more time than 6 weeks to resolve, and that demanding resolution before it was available was its own kind of dishonesty. Marguerite left. Vivienne sat in the front sitting room after she'd gone, and she thought about the specific shape of the last 2 months, the corridor at the Holt estate, where it had started, and this room, where she had made the decisions that determined everything afterward, and the November garden, and the morning in Helena Cartwright's drawing room where 30 people had watched the architecture of a decade's fraud begin to come apart. She thought about her father's face in the month before the Derbyshire sale, and she thought about the fact that she would never be able to ask him what he knew and when he knew it, and that this was the specific grief that had no external object and no resolution and simply had to be carried, the way some things were carried, not because they became lighter, but because the person carrying them became something capable of the weight. She had not become capable of it by choosing to. She had become capable of it by going through the last 2 months, which had required her to be capable and had not offered the alternative. That was how it worked, she thought, not the version she had believed before, the version where strength was a quality you developed in preparation for difficult things, the actual version that the difficult things arrived before you were ready, and the readiness was assembled in the middle of them, from whatever materials were available, including damaged ones, including the borrowed clarity of people who stood beside you when the ground was uncertain. The first time Lucie stayed for dinner, it was in the 2nd week of December, and it was unplanned in the sense of not being formally arranged, which was itself a form of planning for 2 people who were precise about most things, and had discovered in each other the particular relief of not needing to be. They had been going over Ashworth's committee correspondence at the dining room table, and the evening had accumulated around them, And at some point, the line between working and simply being in a room together had become a line neither of them had felt the need to identify. He looked up from the correspondence at some point and said, "You're not reading that." "I read it an hour ago," she said. "Then why are you—" "I'm thinking." "About?" She looked at him across the dining room table, the particular light of December evening doing what it did to rooms and faces, making them more interior, more honest. "About the fact that the last 2 months have been the most difficult of my life," she said, "and also the most— I don't have the right word." "Real," he said. She looked at him. "Real," he said again, simply, without decoration. The word of a man who had spent most of his adult life in the management of appearance and had found, in the last 2 months, something that did not require management. She thought about what real cost, the specific price of it, paid in the corridor at the Holt estate, and in the stopped carriage, and in Threlfall's letter, and in the November garden, and in Marguerite's face across the sitting room. She thought about whether real, at that price, was worth wanting. She thought it was. She thought it was the only thing that was. "Yes," she said, "real." Outside, December did its work on the city, cold and honest and indifferent to the specific lives being assembled inside its buildings. Inside, the room held two people who had arrived at something through the particular route they had arrived through, and who understood that the something they had arrived at was not the comfortable version, and was not the version either of them had planned for, and was, precisely because of that, exactly what it needed to be. Lucien reached across the table and picked up the correspondence she hadn't been reading and set it aside. "Leave it," he said. "There's still— it will be there tomorrow." He looked at her with the full and unguarded quality of a man who had made his decision in a November garden and had not had occasion to regret it. "Tonight, leave it." Vivienne Ashcroft looked at Lucien Blackthorne across the December table, and she thought about the woman who had stood in the corridor at the Holt estate 6 weeks ago with her hand on the doorframe and the full understanding that the room on the other side of the wall had decided what she was. That woman and this one shared a name and a history and very little else. She left the correspondence. Outside, December. Inside, the specific warmth of a room where two people have chosen, against reasonable expectation and through the full complexity of what choosing actually costs, to remain. That was all. That was everything.